You're standing on the Via Sacra, the sacred road, the most important street in the most powerful city the ancient world had ever known. It is the year 64 AD, and the air around you is thick with ash. Not the clean grey ash of a winter hearth, but the heavy, choking black soot of a city on fire. Rome is burning, has been burning for 6 days now. The flames started somewhere in the Circus Maximus. At least, that is what people are saying. And they have not stopped. They have eaten through the Aventine Hill, devoured entire neighbourhoods of wooden apartment blocks, reduced centuries of accumulated human civilization to glowing embers and smouldering rubble. Around you, people are running, screaming, carrying whatever they could grab in the first moments of panic. A child, a jewellery box, a small bronze figurine of a household god. That last detail matters, because in Rome, even in the middle of catastrophe, even when everything is burning, people reach first for their gods, and somewhere across the city, in the palace on the Palatine Hill, or so the rumour goes, and Rome runs on rumours the way it runs on grain, the Emperor Nero is watching. Some say he is laughing. Some say he is playing his lyre. Some say he ordered the fire himself, that he wanted to clear space for a new palace, a new Rome, a Rome made in his own image. Some say it was the Christians, the strange new cult from Judea, the people who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods, who whispered about a coming kingdom, who met in basements and refused to participate in the religious life of the city. Nero, looking for someone to blame, would eventually point his finger at them, and when he did, he changed history. Not just the history of Rome, the history of the world. This is the story of Roman religion, not just one religion, not just one emperor, not just one moment of crisis. This is the full arc, 8 centuries of sacred ritual, theological transformation, and holy war, that explains how a city of 7 hills became the capital of the Western world, and then, in the span of a few extraordinary centuries, was undone partly by the very faith it had adopted. This is the story of how Rome's gods made Rome great, how Rome's emperors tried to make themselves gods, how a Jewish carpenter's teachings conquered an empire that had killed him, and how, in the end, and the city that had fed Christians to lions found itself ruled by a Christian emperor who fed everyone else to the lions instead. The stakes could not be higher, because what happened in Rome did not stay in Rome. Every religious tradition that shaped the Western world, Christianity, the remnants of paganism, the theology of sin and redemption, the very idea of a universal church, ran through this city. The decisions made by emperors and bishops and ordinary believers on these 7 hills rippled outward across 2,000 years and are still, right now, shaping the world you live in. So stay with me, because we are going back to the beginning. To understand what Rome lost, you have to understand what Rome had. And what Rome had in the beginning was an extraordinary religious system unlike anything else in the ancient world. Rome was not born with a single god or a single creed, and Rome was born with a principle. The principle was this: the gods are real, the gods are everywhere, the gods can be appeased, and if you appease them correctly, they will protect you. This sounds simple. It was anything but. Roman religion in its earliest form was an extraordinarily complex, meticulous, almost bureaucratic system of ritual obligation. The Romans had a concept they called the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. And maintaining that peace was not a spiritual exercise. It was a civic duty. It was the foundation upon which the entire Roman state rested. For the Romans, religion was not primarily about personal salvation. It was not about your individual relationship with a divine being. It was not about what happened to your soul after you died. Roman religion was about the collective, the city, the state, the community. If Rome prospered, the gods were pleased. If Rome suffered defeat or plague or famine, somewhere, somehow, the sacred rituals had been neglected. Some offence had been committed. The Pax Deorum had been broken, and it needed to be restored. This is why Roman religion was so heavily focused on ritual precision. The priestly colleges that administered Roman religion, the pontiffs, the augurs, the flamines, the vestals, were not spiritual guides in any modern sense. They were technicians, specialists in the correct performance of sacred procedures. The augurs were experts in reading omens, the flight of birds, the behavior of the sacred chickens, the appearance of a lightning in the sky. All of these were messages from the gods, and interpreting them correctly was a matter of life and death for the Roman state. Before any major military campaign, the augurs would be consulted. Their verdict could halt an entire army in its tracks. And then there were the Vestals, 6 women, chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, who served the goddess Vesta for 30 years. They tended the sacred flame that burned in the temple of Vesta in the Forum, a flame that was understood to be the divine life force of Rome itself. If the flame went out, it was a catastrophe, a sign of divine abandonment, and if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, understood not as a personal moral failing but as a religious pollution that endangered the entire city, the punishment was to be buried alive. Not killed outright, because Vestal blood could not be spilled. Why but sealed in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and left to die? That detail tells you everything you need to know about Roman religion. It was serious. It was literal. It was connected to real political and military power in ways that are almost impossible to understand from a modern perspective. Rome did not separate church and state. For Rome, they were the same thing, and this system worked. For centuries, it worked spectacularly well. Rome expanded from a small city-state on the Tiber to the dominant power of the Italian peninsula. It defeated Carthage twice, then a third time for good measure. It conquered Greece and Macedonia and made the Mediterranean a Roman lake. Historians debate endlessly about the material causes of Roman expansion, the superiority of the legion, the pragmatism of Roman diplomacy, the economic incentives of conquest. But the Romans themselves had no doubt about the primary cause. It was the Pax Deorum. The gods favoured Rome. Rome honoured the gods. That was the deal. The Roman historian Livy, writing in the age of Augustus, argued directly that Rome's greatness was inseparable from Roman piety. That the Romans were the most religious of all peoples, and that their empire was the proof of divine favour. This was not just a rhetorical flourish. It was a genuine theological claim that most educated Romans in the Republican and early Imperial period would have recognised and endorsed. But there was a complication built into this system from the very beginning. What do you do with the gods of the people you conquer? The Roman answer to this question was one of their most brilliant innovations. They called it Interpretatio Romana. When Rome encountered a foreign deity, it did not try to suppress or destroy it. Instead, it looked for the Roman equivalent. Jupiter and the Greek Zeus were the same god under different names: Mars and Ares, Minerva and Athena, Mercury and Hermes. This allowed Rome to absorb the religious traditions of conquered peoples into its own framework. For the most part, this system was remarkably tolerant. Rome was a city of temples to hundreds of different gods. And walk through the city in the 1st century AD, and you would pass shrines to Egyptian Isis and Persian Mithras and Syrian Baal, alongside the traditional Roman deities. There were limits, of course. Romans were suspicious of religious traditions that demanded exclusive devotion, that required believers to reject all other gods, or that seemed to encourage social withdrawal from civic life. In 186 BC, the Senate issued a sweeping decree against the Bacchanalian cult, executing many of its leaders. The charge was not precisely religious, it was social, that the cult was operating as a secret society, a state within the state, that its nocturnal meetings and initiation rites were cover for criminal activity and sexual license. This Bacchanalian affair establishes a pattern that will recur again and again in Roman religious history. Rome was not intolerant of foreign gods per se. Rome was intolerant of anything that threatened the social order, the primacy of the state, the civic bonds that held the community together. That distinction matters enormously for understanding everything that comes later. By the time Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC, something had begun to shift in Roman religious culture. The old republican religion, with its emphasis on collective civic piety, was being supplemented by something newer and stranger. The idea that individual human beings could possess divine qualities, that extraordinary men might be more than merely human. This idea came from the Hellenistic world that Rome had conquered. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his successors had adopted and expanded the practice of ruler worship. In Egypt especially, the king had always been understood as divine, as the living embodiment of the divine order on earth. When the Romans absorbed these cultures, they absorbed these ideas along with everything else. Augustus, the first emperor, was extraordinarily canny about this. He took on the role of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Roman religion, making himself the head of the religious establishment as well as the political one. He promoted the cult of Apollo as his personal divine patron. He accepted divine honours from client kingdoms in the East, while being more restrained in Rome itself. And he systematically built a religious framework around his own person that would eventually normalise the idea of the divine emperor. He also promoted what scholars call the Imperial cult, the worship of the emperor's genius, his divine spirit or creative force as a public religious act. In Rome itself, this was practiced in a somewhat restrained form. But in the provinces, especially in the East where ruler worship was already deeply embedded in the culture, the distinction between honouring the emperor's spirit and honouring the emperor himself quickly blurred. Temples were built to Augustus as a god. Cities competed for the honour of hosting the imperial cult. This development had enormous consequences. The imperial cult was an attempt to use religion to solve a political problem. If the emperor was not just a man but a being of special divine status, if his authority came not just from military force but from the gods themselves, then opposing him was not just politically dangerous, it was impious. It was a violation of the divine order. Later emperors pushed this further. Caligula reportedly demanded to be worshipped as a living god during his own lifetime. Domitian insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Diocletian elaborated an entire theology of imperial divinity, presenting himself as the earthly representative of Jupiter himself. Here is where it gets complicated. Because running alongside this development of the divine emperor was another development, quieter and more subterranean at first, that would eventually destroy the entire system. In the small towns and synagogues and fishing villages of the region Rome called Judea, something was happening that would change everything. Rome had dealt with dozens of foreign religions through Interpretatio Romana, finding the Roman equivalents, absorbing what was compatible. But Judaism resisted this process completely. Because Judaism was, at its theological core, strictly monotheistic. There was one God only, and that God forbade the worship of any other deity. This put Jews in Rome in an impossible position. The social and civic life of any Roman city was saturated with religious ritual. The public festivals, and the sacrifices, the games, the ceremonies that accompanied political assemblies, all of these involved honouring the traditional Roman gods or the imperial cult. For most people in the empire, this was no problem. For Jews, it was not compatible at all, and yet, remarkably, Rome found a way to accommodate them. Judaism was recognized as a religio licita, a lawful religion. Jews were officially exempted from the requirement to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Yeah, they were allowed to observe the Sabbath, but the relationship was always tense, always conditional, always one political crisis away from catastrophe. And in 66 AD, it fell apart completely. The Jewish revolt of 66 AD was triggered by Roman administrative incompetence, financial exploitation, religious provocation, and deep Jewish resentment of foreign rule that had been building for generations. It ended in 70 AD with the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian. The temple, the sacred center of Jewish religious life, the structure that Herod the Great had spent decades rebuilding into one of the most magnificent buildings in the ancient world, was burned to the ground. For Judaism, this was an unimaginable catastrophe. The temple had been the center of the sacrificial cult that was the heart of Jewish religious practice. Without it, the entire system of worship had to be reimagined from scratch. And this is the moment when Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the synagogue, of prayer replacing sacrifice, of Torah study as the primary religious act, begins to take definitive shape. The rabbis who survived the destruction, meeting at Yavne on the coast of Judea, began the extraordinary intellectual project of rebuilding Jewish religion around the text and the community, rather than the temple and the priesthood. It is one of the most remarkable religious transformations in human history. But something else was happening alongside this transformation. Actually, something else had been happening for 3 decades already, rooted in events that took place while the temple was still standing, in a Roman province on the eastern edge of the empire during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. The first century in Judea was not a single, unified religious world. It was a world of competing visions, competing answers to the urgent question, what does God want from his people? And how should they respond to foreign domination? The Pharisees focused on the precise interpretation of Torah. The Sadducees, drawn from the priestly aristocracy, controlled the temple. The Essenes had withdrawn entirely from mainstream Jewish society, waiting for divine intervention. The Zealots were convinced that God wanted his people to fight, and there were dozens of prophets and teachers and Messiah claimants moving through the crowds, each proclaiming a vision of the coming kingdom of God. Jesus entered this landscape as a teacher, healer, and prophet from Galilee, who proclaimed that the kingdom of God was at hand. His message had several elements that were recognizable within the Jewish tradition, and several that were radical departures. He taught in parables, he performed miracles, he gathered disciples, he proclaimed a vision of divine love and mercy that included the poor, the sick, tax collectors, prostitutes, Samaritans, all those who stood at the margins of respectable Jewish society. He also said things that got him killed. His entry into Jerusalem at Passover, the most politically charged moment in the most politically charged city in the empire, was a deliberate provocation. Riding on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy in Zechariah about the coming king of Israel, greeted by crowds spreading palm branches, this was a messianic claim in the most loaded possible context. The temple authorities were nervous. The Roman prefect Pontius Pilate was nervous. Passover drew crowds of hundreds of thousands to Jerusalem, and those crowds were full of messianic expectation and anti-Roman feeling. Jesus then went into the temple and drove out the money changers, an act that was either a symbolic prophecy of the temple's coming destruction, a critique of the corruption of the priestly establishment, or both. The consequence was clear. The temple authorities decided he had to be neutralized. He was arrested, tried by the Jewish council, and handed over to Pontius Pilate, who ultimately capitulated to the pressure of the crowd and the temple authorities. Jesus was crucified, a method of execution that Rome reserved for slaves, revolutionaries, and the lowest of criminals. A method designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to mark its victim as the opposite of everything respectable and powerful and divine. 3 days later, yet according to the accounts that form the foundation of Christian faith, the tomb was empty. Whatever one believes about the resurrection, and historians of religion take a wide range of positions, from fully credulous to fully skeptical, to the carefully agnostic middle ground that acknowledges the historian's inability to adjudicate supernatural claims. What is historically certain is that within weeks of the crucifixion, the disciples of Jesus were proclaiming that he had risen from the dead, and within a generation this proclamation had spread from Jerusalem to Antioch to Rome itself. The person most responsible for that extraordinary spread was not one of the 12 disciples who had known Jesus personally. It was a Pharisee from Tarsus named Saul, who had been a fierce persecutor of the early Jesus movement, and who experienced on the road to Damascus what he described as an encounter with the risen Christ that transformed him completely. As Paul, he became the most important missionary in the history of Christianity, travelling across the eastern Mediterranean, founding communities in Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Ephesus, and writing letters that are the earliest surviving Christian documents and that still shape Christian theology 2,000 years later. Paul's theological genius was to take the Jewish framework of Jesus' message and translate it into terms that could speak to the non-Jewish world. The death and resurrection of Jesus were presented as a cosmic event of universal significance, not just the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, but the turning point of all human history, the moment when the power of sin and death was broken and a new creation began. Early Christianity was not a monolith. It was a diverse, fractious, intensely debated movement in which different communities held significantly different views about the nature of Jesus, the requirements for salvation, and the relationship to Jewish law and the attitude toward Roman authority. But it was spreading. By the time Rome burned in 64 AD, there was already a substantial Christian community in the city. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about 50 years after the events, gives us the most famous account of Nero's persecution. He calls Christianity a destructive superstition, exitiabilis superstitio, and notes that Christians were convicted not so much for arson, as for hatred of the human race. So that phrase, odium humani generis, is remarkable. It suggests that what bothered Romans about Christians was not primarily theological but social. The Christians were anti-social. They refused to participate in the communal religious life that bound Roman society together. This accusation echoes the earlier Roman concern about the Bacchanalians. The early Christians refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. From the Roman perspective, this was a form of civic sabotage. Every sacrifice to the gods was also a sacrifice on behalf of the community. A person who refused to sacrifice was not just making a private religious choice. They were free-riding on the religious community's maintenance of the divine favour while contributing nothing. Worse, they were actively denying the reality of the gods, which was understood as a form of atheism. The Christians were frequently called atheists by their pagan neighbours. They also held secret meetings. So the Eucharist, the ritual meal at the centre of early Christian worship, was performed within the closed community of believers. Rumours circulated among non-Christians about what went on at these meetings. The talk of eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ led to accusations of cannibalism. The greeting of brothers and sisters with a kiss led to accusations of incest. None of this was true. But the secrecy that early Christians maintained out of fear of persecution generated the rumours that made persecution more likely. A vicious cycle with real victims. The Neronian persecution, whatever its extent, was a turning point. Peter and Paul, by tradition, were both martyred in Rome during this period. Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded. These deaths gave the Roman Christian community a founding mythology of blood and sacrifice that would shape its identity for centuries. The martyr became the supreme Christian hero. The word itself comes from the Greek for witness. To die for the faith was to be the ultimate witness to its truth. The persecutions between the 1st and early 4th centuries were, with some major exceptions, largely local and sporadic rather than empire-wide and systematic. They were triggered by specific events: a fire that needed a scapegoat, a governor who was particularly zealous, a local mob that took its anger out on the Christians who were conveniently available as targets. The saying attributed to Trajan, in his famous exchange with the younger Pliny around 112 AD, captures the official attitude of most of the 2nd century. Christians should not be sought out, but if denounced and they confess, they should be punished. No anonymous denunciations. Pliny's letter to Trajan is one of the most important surviving documents for understanding Roman official attitudes toward early Christianity. Pliny was the governor of Bithynia in modern Turkey, genuinely unsure how to handle the Christians brought before him. He investigated them as thoroughly as he could, and found nothing politically threatening. They met before dawn, sang hymns to Christ as to a god, bound themselves by oath to avoid criminal activity, and ate ordinary food. So nothing that fit the standard accusations of cannibalism and orgies. Trajan's response was notably measured, affirming that those properly convicted should be punished, but insisting they should not be hunted proactively. The truly systematic empire-wide persecutions came much later, primarily under Decius in 249 to 251 AD, and under Diocletian in 303 to 311 AD. And Decius issued an empire-wide edict requiring all inhabitants of the Roman Empire to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods and to obtain a certificate proving they had done so. This was not targeted at Christians specifically, but Christians were the primary group who refused. When the persecution ended with Decius's death in battle, the question of what to do with those who had caved the lapsed, tore Christian communities apart. The theological debates that followed had lasting consequences for the development of Christian ecclesiology. The Great Persecution under Diocletian, beginning in 303 AD, was the most severe and systematic attack on Christianity in the empire's history. Churches were torn down. Sacred scriptures were seized and burned. This is the origin of the term traditores, those who handed over the books, from which we get the word traitor. Christian clergy were imprisoned and ordered to sacrifice. The persecution was brutal and lasted nearly a decade, and it failed completely. By 311 AD, the Emperor Galerius, one of the most enthusiastic persecutors, issued an edict of toleration acknowledging that the persecution had not achieved its goal. Galerius, dying painfully, apparently hoped for Christian prayers on his behalf. 2 years later, everything changed. You need to picture this scene. It is October 28th, 312 AD. Two Roman armies face each other at the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome, above the flood-prone banks of the Tiber. On one side is Maxentius, who controls Rome and has built an enormous army. On the other side is Constantine, who controls the western provinces from Britain to Spain and is marching on Rome to settle, once and for all, the question of who rules the Western Empire. What happened the night before the battle is one of the most contested events in all of ancient history. Constantine himself, late in his life, told the church historian Eusebius a story. He said that he had seen a sign in the sky, a vision of the cross of Christ with the words in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, conquer. In a dream, he said, Christ had told him to put this symbol on his soldiers' shields. Whether it was a solar phenomenon misinterpreted through religious expectation, a genuine visionary experience, or a politically calculated invention, historians cannot say with certainty. What is certain is that Constantine won the battle. Maxentius's army was driven into the Tiber and Maxentius drowned. Constantine entered Rome as the master of the Western Empire, and very shortly afterward he made a series of decisions that would change the history of the world. Early in 313 AD, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius jointly issued a policy of religious tolerance known as the Edict of Milan. Christians were granted full religious freedom, and confiscated church property was to be restored. Christianity was now a religio licita on equal footing with every other cult in the empire. But Constantine went much further than mere toleration. He became a patron of Christianity on a spectacular scale. He built churches, enormous, magnificent basilicas that announced the presence and power of the new faith. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, the first St. Peter's Basilica on the Vatican Hill, over the spot believed to be Peter's tomb, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. These buildings were not modest chapels, they were the largest and most expensive public buildings in the empire, expressing in stone and marble the imperial endorsement of the Christian God. He gave the clergy legal privileges. He exempted them from certain public obligations. He allowed the church to receive bequests. He declared Sunday a public holiday. He minted coins with Christian symbols. He convened and presided over church councils to resolve theological disputes. What did Constantine actually believe? This question has generated an enormous scholarly literature unlikely to ever be definitively resolved. He was not baptized until he was on his deathbed, which might suggest his Christianity was primarily political. but waiting until one's deathbed for baptism was actually common in the early church. His private letters and speeches contain genuine religious feeling. His behaviour at church councils suggests someone who cared passionately about theological unity, even if he did not fully understand the theological issues at stake. The most historically significant thing about Constantine's religion may not be its authenticity, but its theology of power. Constantine understood the Christian God in terms drawn from the imperial tradition. God was the supreme sovereign, the cosmic emperor. The emperor was the representative of God on earth, his viceroy, his agent. In a strange and paradoxical way, Constantine merged the older Roman theology of the divine emperor with Christian monotheism. There was now one God, one logos, one emperor. The hierarchy was unified from heaven to earth. This theology of Christian empire meant that heresy, theological deviation, was not just a spiritual problem but a political one, since a divided church meant a divided empire, and it created problems almost immediately. Within a few years of Constantine's victory, he found himself confronted with the most serious theological controversy the church had yet faced. The question was deceptively simple. Who exactly was Jesus Christ? Was he God? Was he human? Was he both? The controversy centered on a priest from Alexandria named Arius. Arius taught that the Son of God, the divine Christ, the Logos, was not co-eternal with the Father. He was the first and greatest of God's creations, supremely exalted above all other beings, but he was a creature. He had a beginning. There was a time when he did not exist. In Arius's formulation, the Son was like God, similar to God, but not of the same substance. This seems, from a modern perspective, like a very abstract dispute. But in the 4th century it was understood by all parties as a matter of supreme importance, because what was at stake was not just a theological abstraction. What was at stake was the nature of salvation. Yes, if Christ was a creature rather than God himself, could he save humanity from sin and death? Could a created being unite human beings to the uncreated God? Was the whole Christian story of redemption built on a foundation that was, in the most literal sense, less than divine? The Bishop of Alexandria, Alexander, thought Arius was completely wrong and said so loudly. Arius was excommunicated from Alexandria, but found supporters among other bishops, particularly in the eastern provinces. The controversy spread rapidly. Constantine, horrified that his newly united church was fracturing over what he privately seems to have regarded as a pointless argument about words, called a general council of bishops to resolve the matter. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is one of the most important events in the history of Christianity. Bishops came from across the empire and convened in the Imperial Palace, in the city of Nicaea in western Turkey. What they produced, after weeks of debate, was the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith declaring that the Son was of the same substance as the Father. The Greek word was homousios, one of the most fought-over words in the history of religious controversy. The Son was not created. He was begotten, not made. He was God from God, light from light, true God from true God. Arius was condemned. His writings were ordered burned. He and those bishops who refused to sign the creed were exiled. But the controversy did not end at Nicaea. It continued, with extraordinary intensity and violence, for decades. Later emperors, particularly Constantius II, actively supported Arian or semi-Arian theology, reversing the Nicene settlement. The theologian Athanasius of Alexandria, who became the great champion of Nicene orthodoxy, was exiled 5 times by different emperors in the course of a career that makes him one of the most embattled figures in church history. The phrase Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, captures the sense in which he stood almost alone at times against imperial pressure. The Arian controversy established the precedent that the emperor had the right and the duty to convene church councils to preside over them and to enforce their decisions. This intimate entanglement of imperial authority and ecclesiastical definition became a permanent feature of Christian political theology that shaped the relationship between church and state in both the Eastern and Western traditions for over 1,000 years. There is a figure who briefly interrupts the story of Christian triumph, and his story deserves attention because it reveals something important about the limits of imperial religious power. Julian, Constantine's nephew, he became emperor in 361 AD. He'd been raised as a Christian. He had been educated in the faith, trained in its theology, and he hated it. Julian had been secretly drawn to the traditional Greco-Roman philosophical and religious tradition, Neoplatonism, the worship of the sun as the supreme divine principle, the old gods of Rome and Greece. When he became emperor, he came out as a pagan with a vengeance. His project was nothing less than the de-Christianization of the Roman Empire. He did not resort to violence. There was no persecution of Christians under Julian. What he did was systematic, and in some ways more insidious. He removed the privileges the church had accumulated under Constantine and his successors, banned Christians from teaching classical literature and rhetoric in the schools, tried to revive the pagan sacrificial cult on a grand scale, and actively promoted a reformed paganism that borrowed heavily from Christianity, including charitable works, communal worship, and a hierarchical priesthood, in an attempt to create a competing form of religion. Julian's attempt failed. He died in 363 AD, barely 2 years into his reign, killed during his ill-fated campaign against Persia. His successors immediately reversed his religious policies and resumed the Constantinian patronage of Christianity. But Julian's reign demonstrated something crucial. Christianity had become so deeply embedded in the social fabric of the empire that an emperor who actively opposed it, with all the resources of imperial power at his disposal, could not dislodge it in 2 years. The church was no longer a marginal cult. It was a social institution with deep roots in every city and province of the empire. Dissolution. Julian's writings also give us the most articulate surviving pagan critique of Christianity from antiquity. His work against the Galileans argues that the Christians had abandoned the universal reason that connected all human beings to the divine, and replaced it with a particular tribal faith, based on the authority of specific texts and a specific revelation. He could not understand why the Christians, if they believed in a God of universal love, he should restrict his covenant to a single people and a single moment in history. He found the Christian idea of the incarnation, that the infinite God had become a specific human being in a specific time and place, philosophically incoherent and religiously degrading. These are not stupid objections. Theologians are still wrestling with them today. And there is something genuinely poignant about Julian's reign that deserves acknowledgement. He was not trying to be a villain. He was a man of deep learning and sincere religious conviction who believed with real passion that what Rome was abandoning was worth fighting for. He wrote hymns to the sun god. He corresponded with philosophers. He tried to live by his principles in ways that many of his contemporaries, Christian or pagan, did not. the church father Gregory of Nazianzus, who knew Julian personally, hated him, but could not help admiring his intellect. Some historians have speculated about what might have happened had Julian lived longer, whether a sustained, reformed paganism really could have competed with Christianity for the allegiance of the empire. Most scholars think not, but the question is worth sitting with, if only to remind ourselves that history is not inevitable. The triumph of Christianity in Rome was a real triumph, not just a foregone conclusion. The final chapter in the official relationship between Rome and paganism was written under the Emperor Theodosius I, who reigned from 379 to 395 AD, and who took the process that Constantine had begun to its logical conclusion. In 380 AD, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity to be the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This was not just a statement of preference or patronage. It was legal definition. All subjects of the empire were required to profess Nicene Christianity. In 391 and 392 AD, Theodosius issued a series of edicts banning pagan sacrifice entirely. Pagan temples were closed. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years since 776 BC, were abolished after more than a millennium of continuous tradition. The sacred flame of Vesta, which had burned for centuries, was extinguished. The Vestals were disbanded. These measures were not implemented without resistance. Symmachus, the prefect of Rome and one of the most distinguished men of his age, wrote a famous petition to the emperors asking for the restoration of the altar of victory in the Senate House. His argument was characteristically Roman in its pluralism. We cannot all approach the great divine mystery by the same road. What you see as superstition, we see as truth. Let us each follow our own tradition. It is one of the most eloquent statements of religious pluralism from the ancient world. The response came from Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, and it was categorical. There would be no restoration of pagan worship. The Christian God did not share space with other gods. The Pax Deorum was over. There was now only one God, and his peace was the only peace worth having. Ambrose won. The altar stayed down. And in that exchange, between Symmachus's tolerant pluralism and Ambrose's confident exclusivism, you can hear the old Rome arguing with the new one and losing. And some of those who grieved the closing of the temples argued, with growing urgency as the 5th century opened, that Rome's troubles, the military pressure on the frontiers, the internal instability, the sense of an empire coming apart, were the direct result of abandoning the old gods. If Rome had prospered under the Pax Deorum, and Rome was now suffering, did that not prove that the old theology was right? That the gods were punishing Rome for its apostasy? On August 24th, 410 AD, Visigoths under the command of their king Alaric entered the city of Rome and sacked it for 3 days. You need to understand what that sentence means. Rome had not been sacked by a foreign enemy in 800 years, and not since the Gauls in 387 BC had any hostile army penetrated the city's walls. Rome was the eternal city, the city that, in the Roman religious imagination, existed under the special protection of the gods and was destined to last forever. When the Visigoths walked through the gates, they were not just looting a city. They were shattering a theological claim about the nature of Roman destiny. The pagan reaction was immediate and furious. This was what happened when you abandoned Jupiter and Juno for a Galilean carpenter. This was what happened when you closed the temples and extinguished the sacred flame. The gods, patient for so long, had finally withdrawn their protection. The Christian response to this challenge came from the most formidable intellect in the entire late antique world. Augustine of Hippo, bishop of a small North African city, was 56 years old when Rome was sacked. His spiritual autobiography, The Confessions, is one of the greatest works of personal religious writing in any language, tracing the journey of a restless, brilliant, sensually driven young man through Manichaeanism and Neoplatonism to his baptism by Ambrose in Milan in 387 AD. Augustine took 13 years to write his response to the sack of Rome. The City of God is, among many other things, the most ambitious theological reinterpretation of history ever attempted. Its argument, summarized briefly, is this: Rome was never what it thought it was. The pagan claim that Rome's greatness was the result of divine favor was false. The pagan gods never protected Rome. Rome prospered despite them, or by the providence of the Christian God who was working his purposes out through Roman history, whether Rome acknowledged him or not. The fall of Rome to Alaric was not divine punishment. It was a reminder that no earthly city is eternal. There is only one eternal city, and it is not Rome. Augustine's great innovation was the concept of the two cities, the city of God, whose citizens love God above themselves, and whose ultimate home is eternal life in the divine presence, and the city of man, whose citizens love themselves above God, whose bonds are the shared pursuit of earthly goods, and whose ultimate horizon is temporal and mortal. These two cities are mixed together in history. You cannot separate them by looking at any human institution. The Church itself contains members of both cities. This framework had incalculable consequences for Western political theology. It meant that no earthly ruler, no emperor, no king, no government could claim the ultimate loyalty that belongs only to God. It meant that the Church and the state were distinct, not separate in the modern sense, but occupying different places in the hierarchy of being and deserving different kinds of loyalty. And it meant that the criticism of earthly power from the perspective of divine justice was always legitimate, always necessary, always part of the Christian vocation. Augustine, dying in 430 AD as the Vandals besieged his city, did not live to see how his theology would shape the next 1500 years. But the shape it gave them is unmistakable even now. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a single catastrophic moment. It dissolved, gradually and unevenly, and over the course of the 5th century as one piece after another was chipped away by barbarian kingdoms that were simultaneously destroying and inheriting Roman civilization. The final act came in 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, whose name, in a cruel historical joke, combined the founder of Rome with the founder of the empire, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who simply declined to appoint a replacement. And yet Rome did not end. That is the paradox that historians have been trying to explain ever since. Because the city of Rome continued, Roman law continued to be administered, the Latin language continued to be spoken and written, Roman culture continued to shape the world that had technically destroyed it. The explanation lies almost entirely in religion, because as the political and military structures of the Western Empire dissolved, the Church remained. The bishops of Rome, increasingly known as the popes, had been accumulating authority and prestige throughout the 5th century, partly because the emperors were increasingly absent or ineffective, and someone had to fill the vacuum of legitimate authority. Pope Leo I, who reigned from 440 to 461 AD, had personally met Attila the Hun outside Rome in 452 AD and persuaded him not to sack the city, an extraordinary act of diplomatic courage that enormously enhanced the papacy's prestige. He also articulated a theology of papal authority, based on the idea that Peter was the chief of the apostles and that the Bishop of Rome, as Peter's successor, inherited Peter's unique role. That would have enormous consequences for the medieval church. When the barbarian kings took over the territories of the Western Empire, they did not destroy the church. They could not. The church was woven into the fabric of society in ways that could not be unwoven without destroying the society itself. The bishops were the literate administrators, the holders of institutional memory, the people who kept the records and maintained the infrastructure of civic life. The barbarian kings needed them. The most important single event in this process was the conversion of Clovis, the king of the Franks, to Catholic Christianity around 496 AD. Most of the other Germanic kingdoms, as the Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Ostrogoths, had been Arian Christians, followers of the theology condemned at Nicaea. Clovis converted directly to Nicene Catholic Christianity, aligning himself with the Bishop of Rome rather than with the Arian churches. This decision had incalculable consequences. It established the Franks as the champions of Catholic orthodoxy, and the alliance between the Frankish kingdom and the papacy would eventually produce Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire, and the entire edifice of medieval Christian civilization. Let us pull back from the specific theological controversies and the political dramas and try to see the larger picture. What does all of this mean? What did the religious history of Rome actually do to the world? The answers are more numerous and more complex than any single narrative can fully contain. But there are several threads that seem, from the perspective of 2,000 years, to be particularly significant. The first is the permanent shaping of Western political thought by the tension between religious and political authority. The Roman imperial tradition assumed that these were the same thing, that the emperor was the supreme religious authority as well as the supreme political one, that the Pax Deorum and the Pax Romana were two expressions of the same divine order. Christianity broke this assumption, never completely and not immediately, but irrevocably. The Church was a distinct institution from the state, with its own leadership, its own law, its own sources of legitimacy. The claims of Christ, render to God what is God's, meant that there was always a domain of life that the state could not fully control. This does not mean that the medieval church was a champion of the separation of church and state in any modern sense. It was not. The church used coercion as readily as the state did, and the two institutions spent centuries fighting over which of them had the right to coerce whom. But the basic principle, that there is a God above the state, that political authority is not ultimate, that the ruler is accountable to a higher law, that principle came into Western consciousness through the Christian theological tradition, and it has never fully left. The second thread is the extraordinary durability and transformative power of the martyr tradition. Rome intended to neutralize Christianity by killing its leaders, terrorizing its communities, and demonstrating the futility of resistance to imperial power. It achieved precisely the opposite. The martyrs became the seed of the church, the willingness to die rather than compromise, rather than sacrifice to the emperor's image, rather than renounce the name of Christ, was understood as the ultimate proof of the faith's truth. A religion that produced people willing to die for it rather than abandon it must have something that other religions did not: This martyr theology had consequences far beyond Christianity. It became the template for religious commitment in the Western tradition, the idea that faith is worth dying for, that the willingness to be martyred is the supreme expression of religious sincerity. It shaped how Christians understood death itself, and it shaped in complex and sometimes distorted ways the theology of violence in the service of religion that would eventually produce the Crusades, the Inquisition, and other darker chapters in the story of Christian civilization. The third thread is the role of theological controversy in shaping institutional development. The great controversies of the 4th and 5th centuries, Arianism, Donatism, Pelagianism, Nestorianism, monophysitism, were not merely abstract intellectual disputes. They were the crucible in which Christian institutions were formed. The ecumenical councils that defined orthodox theology also established the structures of ecclesiastical authority, the role of bishops, the relationship between local churches and the universal church. The creeds that emerge from these councils are still recited in churches across the world. The institutional patterns they established are still recognizable in the Catholic, Orthodox, and many Protestant traditions today. The fourth thread is the enduring question of religious diversity and its relationship to political order. Rome's original answer, the Pax Deorum maintained through collective ritual, accommodating foreign gods through Interpretatio Romana, was a form of managed pluralism that worked reasonably well for centuries. Christianity's answer, one God, one truth, or one church, heresy as political crime, was a form of enforced unity that produced both the extraordinary creative achievements of medieval Christendom and the extraordinary violence of religious warfare. Neither answer has proven entirely satisfactory. The modern world is still wrestling with the question that Symmachus and Ambrose debated in the 4th century. Can a political community hold together across genuine religious diversity? What does it owe its members in terms of religious freedom? What does it require from them in terms of shared commitment to common values? These are not questions that Rome solved, or that Christianity solved. They are questions that Roman Christianity bequeathed to us, along with everything else in the Western inheritance. You're standing in the Roman Forum, but it is not 64 AD anymore. It is now. The buildings around you are ruins, but they are ruins of extraordinary beauty and power. And to your left is the Temple of Saturn, 8 columns still standing after 2,000 years. Ahead of you is the Arch of Titus, with its carved relief of Romans carrying the sacred objects of the Jerusalem temple in triumph. Behind you is the Arch of Constantine, built to celebrate the victory at the Milvian Bridge, decorated with reliefs taken from earlier monuments to earlier emperors, a patchwork of Roman history pressed into a single monument to the man who changed everything. The sacred flame of Vesta has been cold for 1600 years. The last augur read his last flight of birds sometime in the late 4th century and was not replaced. The temples to Jupiter and Mars and Minerva and Isis are all fallen, their stones robbed out over the centuries to build the churches that replaced them. Beneath the floor of almost every old church in Rome, if you dig deep enough, you will find the foundations of something older, a temple, a Mithric sanctuary, a house where early Christians gathered in secret. The gods did not disappear, they transformed. The mother goddess worshipped under 100 names across the ancient Mediterranean found a new expression in the cult of the Virgin Mary. The cult of heroes and divine men found a new expression in the veneration of the saints. The mystery religion's promise of personal transformation and eternal life through participation in the death and rebirth of a divine figure found a new expression in the Christian sacraments. The ancient human need for ritual, for sacred space, for communal celebration of the great transitions of life, these did not end with paganism. They continued, adapted and reinterpreted in new forms. The Roman Catholic Church is, among many other things, the most direct institutional continuity with ancient Rome that still exists. The Pope's official title of Pontifex Maximus was inherited from the Roman Imperial religious office. The cardinal's red vestments echo the purple of Roman senators. The Church's administrative structure, dioceses, provinces, patriarchates, was inherited directly from the Roman administrative system. The Latin that was the language of Roman power became the language of Western Christianity for 1500 years. The Church's law developed in close dialogue with Roman civil law and preserved many of its structures. This is not a coincidence. It is the most extraordinary example in human history of what happens when a great civilization meets a great religion. Each transforms the other. Rome transformed Christianity, giving it an institutional structure, a legal framework, a philosophical vocabulary, a sense of universal mission, and an identification with power and civilization that it did not have in its Palestinian beginnings. And Christianity transformed Rome, giving it a new theological foundation, a new understanding of human dignity and divine love, a new institution, the Church, that survived the political collapse of the empire and carried Roman civilization forward into the medieval world. Whether this transformation was, on balance, good or bad for humanity is a question that people have been arguing about since Edward Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, and blamed Christianity for Rome's decline. Modern historians are generally more nuanced, recognizing that the relationship between Rome's Christianization and its political collapse was complex, indirect, and contested. Rome did not fall because of Christianity. Rome fell for many reasons: military, economic, political, demographic, and Christianity was both a symptom of the empire's transformation and a resource for surviving it. What is certain is that the story did not end with the fall of Rome. In some sense, it is still going. The institutions, the ideas, the theological arguments, the political tensions forged in those 8 centuries of Roman religious history are still alive in the world. Every time a Western government debates the relationship between religion and public life, it is revisiting arguments that Ambrose and Theodosius and Augustine were making in the 4th century. Every time a church asserts its independence from state control, it is drawing on the tradition of resistance that the martyrs established. Every time someone asks whether there is a law higher than the law of the state, they are asking the question that Paul raised when he wrote to the Romans from Corinth 2,000 years ago. Rome built the world that Christianity inherited. Our Christianity built the world that we inherited, and somewhere in the ruins of the Forum, in the stones of churches built on the foundations of temples, in the Latin of the Mass and the structures of canon law, and the ghost of the Pontifex Maximus in the office of the Pope. Somewhere in all of that, the old gods are still watching, still waiting to see what we do with what they gave us. The eternal city was never just a city. It was always a question about what human beings owe to each other, to their gods, and to the generations that come after them. We're still trying to answer it. We may never stop, and that is the story of Rome's Roman Empire. The city that thought its gods had made it eternal, that watched its gods die, and replace them with a God who promised something better than eternity, a love that death itself could not extinguish. Whether that promise was kept is a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But the city that raised the question still stands, in its ruins and its churches and its history daring us to ask it.